Hi, everybody. Last year at the IRVA conference, they had me as a speaker following Russell Targ. You may remember if you were here, and I was like, oh, that's going to be a tough act to follow. How am I going to get all these people excited? And then this time they put me after Jeffrey, so I'm like, oh, man. I feel like I'm the second act guy, you know, they bring in afterwards to bring everybody together again.
They know you're good enough to play.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to talk about Hemi-Sync and remote viewing. I think it says remote viewing and Hemi-Sync on your program, but I think we'll talk probably about something along those lines. Now, this is an excellent talk to follow Jeffrey because it pertains to a concept of training and also pertains to a concept of relaxing, meditating as part of the remote viewing process. But I want to explain a little bit about the technology called Hemi-Sync. Right now, my job is as the research director for the Monroe Institute, which is where Hemi-Sync comes from. And in my past life experience, you know me being involved in remote viewing. I was the operations and training officer for 10 years for the military remote viewing program. So I'm going to try to share with you a blending of the past and the present understanding and how that might apply to remote viewing for y'all. And I have a PowerPoint program that will probably work wonderfully here. Maybe I ought to push the button again, see if it works. Okay, Hemi-Sync, the Hemi-Sync process is a trademark name, and what it actually has to do with is something called binaural beating. And binaural beating is an audio phenomena, which we're going to talk about in more depth than you really want to know about here in just a couple seconds. But it's a natural process. So Mr. Monroe, who is the progenitor of this thing called Hemi-Sync, didn't invent binaural beating. It's just an anomaly that happens physiologically when you hear two slightly out of phase sounds. The brain fixes that and creates a third sound or pulse for you. And Mr. Monroe nicknamed, for trademark purposes, that thing called Hemi-Sync. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that is, how it works in the brain, and so forth. The Monroe Institute itself is a fairly large organization. We've been around for a little over 40 years now. These are our three main buildings, and I work down here in the lab. They put me in the smallest building. I don't know why they did that. People who work in laboratories, you know, it's like growing mushrooms. They keep you in the dark and put no windows on the walls and things like that. So that's where I work. Now, in addressing this concept of Hemi-Sync and remote viewing, let's make a clear distinction about two different things. We don't teach remote viewing at the Monroe Institute. We teach the expansion of your personal consciousness, and what you do with that and how you use that, your sort of own subjective experience with that is up to you. And then I'll take two steps to the right and we'll say, but, you know, there is this other aspect that might work too. So we're going to talk about that. But let's get steeped in this technology of Hemi-Sync to begin with. Now, binaural beating, this phenomenon of the brain, occurs when there are two slightly different sounds that are present to our ears. Now, this is a physiological thing, and it's believed to come from some sort of adaptation of survival, some Darwinian concept of survival. So we might imagine, you know, we're walking out in the jungle thousands of years ago and we hear the saber-toothed tiger growl over here, and I know that that's where the tiger is, and if I run this direction, I'm going to survive, and I'm going to do some begatting, and I'm going to create ancestors, right? And then we move up to the 21st century and we ask, well, what is it about me that allowed me to survive? And we run back tens of thousands of years and we look at our predecessor there, and we find that he was able to tell the direction of lower frequency sounds because as the tiger's growl rolled into this ear, and a microsecond later went into this ear, our brain was able to discern those. We would call them a timing difference back then until we invent physics a few tens of thousands of years later, then we call it a phase difference. But back here, we might call it a timing difference, and we learned that if we turned our head, we could neutralize that timing difference, and we would be able to find where that was, and then we would run this direction here. We invent earphones and recreate that same thing here, putting the two different sounds in one ear and the other ear. And now it's an artificial creation of something that our brain is already adapted to. But we can't escape the headphones. We can't turn around and equalize the difference in the input in our ears, but the brain still detects these differences, so it gives rise to executive consciousness saying, hey, what's that funny sound, wah, 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 that I'm hearing? But it's not a sound coming from the outside, because if you take your earphone off, it's not in there and it's not in there. It's a product of the way your brain deals with the fact there's a slight difference between the input in this ear and the input in the other ear. And again, Mr. Monroe didn't invent this. He didn't even discover it. He just found a way to use it. But this is a normal physiological response to having slightly different sounds in one ear and the other. When the sounds come together, they create an amplitude modulated pulse. At least that's the experience we have of these two sounds coming together. And in the hearing centers of our brain called the olivary nuclei, the hearing centers of the brain is where the hard wiring, so to speak, of each ear come together and the two signals get processed. And from there, down the brainstem, into the reticular activating system. The reticular activating system is what controls the arousal level of the brain. It tells this part of the brain to wake up to process, this part of the brain to wake up to process. The reticular activating system does that. All our senses go through the reticular activating system, except for smell. Smell seems to go directly to the cortex. You don't have to wake up a special process in the brain to process smell. How does it do that? Well, it's a wet system. It's a neurochemical system. So this pulsing sound comes into the reticular and affects the amount of acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter, up on the cortex, changing the rate of brain waves. We call this arousal. The amount of brainwave activity and the frequency of the brainwave activity is simply defined as an arousal pattern, all responsible for a hardwired system in our brain called the reticular activating system. So when people come to me and they ask me, well, how does Hemi-Sync work? My very first answer is always, it works very well. Okay? And I see how long that rests with them, and if they nod and they go away nicely, then that's fine. They got the answer they're looking for, and then they might say, no, I mean, like, how does it work? And I think, oh man, I got into that brain stuff again, you know, how am I going to deal with this? So, this brain stuff is an interesting thing for me to deal with because the Monroe Institute says, you know, we're more than our physical bodies and we're more than our brains. This isn't really who we are. So here I am looking at people's brains and describing how this works and how this happens, and yet I'm saying, but this isn't really who we are. What is this all about? And Bob Monroe had a simple example. You know, he'd just wave his hands. Oh, you're just measuring the smoke, not the fire. You know, don't get all tied up about the whole thing. And this whole idea of brains and measuring brains, I thought was an interesting thing. I don't know how many of you saw Newsweek recently. What month was this? Back in the springtime. You know, God made the cover of Newsweek. I don't know if you noticed that. And it's a very interesting kind of a concept, yes. I never thought of it one way or the other, but, you know. What this paper was all about when I looked at the first thing is neural correlates of the spiritual experience. Oh man, not another one of these papers. They're going to try to cram everything down into, it's not real, it's just your brain waves, you know, kind of a thing. But I was surprised by the paper because they went on to explain that just because we as scientists can find neurological correlates of the spiritual experiences you have makes no testimony whatsoever about the validity of the experience. And the way they explained that was to say a neuroscientist with too much time on his hands would be able to determine the neurological correlates of eating apple pie. And you could do that. You could measure, with all these millions of dollars worth of instruments and say, look, we can tell when this person is eating apple pie. There are the neurological correlates of eating apple pie. Does that make the apple pie go away, though? Does it obviate the reality of the experience of eating the apple pie? No, not at all. Just because you have neurological correlates to your experience. So I found experiences of God having neurological correlates, which I thought, oh no, they're trying to cram it all back down in your brain again, to be very surprising in the opening that the scientists are allowing themselves now to say, just because we have discovered this interesting thing in our brains does not make a testimony about whether it's real or not. They've tried to do that with out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences and, tunnel vision and the random firing of the this and the that. And just because they can find that doesn't make any testimony, doesn't say anything about the value or the reality of the experience itself. So as I talk brain stuff, don't get too wrapped around the axle about all that, okay? Now, binaural beats, I want you to be able to hear this. Binaural beats have to do with a sound being heard in one ear, a single tone. Could you all hear some sort of a tone coming out of there? A little loud, okay. How about a different tone, slightly different tone? We'd put these in one in each ear. But when the tones come together, okay, those are the same two tones, but putting them in two different ears, you get this pulsing kind of a sound to it, and that's the thing called the binaural beat. We have very complex mix of binaural beats so that the brain looks at that pattern. Notice how I point to my screen thinking you can see my finger moving across there. That mimic brain waves. They look biological to the reticular activating system. And then we mask them in this pink sound to add effectiveness to it. We found that the threshold of the pink sound actually amplifies the effectiveness of the sound pattern in altering the brain waves. And what we're looking for is taking an incoherent brainwave pattern and turning it into some sort of coherency. And there are lots of different brainwave patterns that indicate different kinds of arousal states. This resting state alpha is really kind of interesting. You just lay down, close your eyes, and most everybody goes into a resting state alpha, this bright alpha amplitude in the back of the head here. Different kinds of states of arousal. And I want to tell you that Hemi-Sync does change your brain waves. There's no doubt about it, it will do that. But I think of this as being two separate dynamics. One is your experience that you have, your subjective experience, which is variable across a wide range of determinants depending upon who you are, the social psychological adaptations that you've had through life, perhaps your own spiritual path or spiritual journey that you're on, as well as your educational level. And I don't mean necessarily formal education. What I mean is how much experience have you had in life? If you were locked up in the same apartment complex till age 12, and you think you go downstairs, you turn left and go to the deli to get the milk, you turn right and go to PS 132, that's your world, the entirety of your experience. Obviously, it's going to limit your repertoire of things that you can experience in the world. So all of those parameters together create your own personal subjective experience. Brain waves and arousal are entirely different. You can have two people in the same brainwave arousal state and have two different entire experiences. And that's important to remember, because if I'm going to create a Hemi-Sync tape in a minute for remote viewing purposes, what I'm saying is I'm going to create a Hemi-Sync tape that puts you in a certain state of consciousness, but it's not going to guarantee or make you a remote viewer. It's just going to sort of invite you into a realm where remote viewing takes place, but not keep you on target, so to speak. So, is there any validity to this thing called Hemi-Sync research? Well, 40 years ago, there wasn't. 40 years ago, there was Bob Monroe and his experiences and trying to figure out what was going on. And yet now we have a lot of data. In the 90s, we got real busy and produced a lot of data. So there are professional journal publications and university studies, and there are independent investigations by people who were just curious to do things and didn't go out and publish them per se. This very important information is in the hands of experts as we speak. And so any one of these experts you can go to and say, well, tell me about this. And they know this information. It's out there for the public to see. We have our own publications called the Breakthrough in Hemi-Sync Journal, which have to do with professionals that are using the Hemi-Sync process in educational settings, perhaps in the dental office to reduce anxiety before you go in and see the dentist, people using it as a surgery approach to get calmed down and centered. We know the healing process is enhanced tremendously when you remove the fear and participate yourself in generating your own immune system, so there are tapes for that kind of a thing, and all that's written up in our own publications in the Hemi-Sync Journal. And there are lots and lots and lots of just personal anecdotal reports that we put out in our publication called The Focus. So I'm going to, push these buttons really fast about all these studies, not expecting you to read them, but to be overwhelmed by the fact that there's a lot of information available here to those that are interested in that more scientific approach to, well, does this really work, and how might it be used? How can you use this? The university studies are really interesting because you get this oversight of the academic world looking at this PhD or master's student, and it creates a wonderful opportunity for us to have our things studied for free at the university level, kids wanting to do their papers in that way. In the lab itself, I've done some things. So you see there's my name there. When you publish things, you have to have an important sounding name, so then I'm F. Holmes Atwater instead of good old Skip, kind of thing. So nobody'd read anything by a 50-year-old man named Skip, but they might want to read something by a guy named F. Holmes Atwater, so you got to be careful about that. My publisher insisted that the name on my book be F. Holmes Atwater for that same reason, but as you turn the pages at the top where they put the author's name, it says Skip Atwater, but at least I fought for part of who I really was in there. So. Now, in our anecdotal reporting, you see that we have lots of things going on. I have moved away from the more quantitative collection of brainwave data and physiological data into actually asking people, so you're out there in the ethers and you're exploring this, that, and the other thing. Tell me about that world. And so now I'm working on 87 different people reporting their adventures, and I'm looking for commonalities of descriptions in that. So that would be a qualitative style of analysis versus a quantitative style. So we sort of moved away from reflecting back on the body, and we're beginning to look out at your experience and what does it really mean. And there are other people having similar experiences. And as Jeffrey was saying, is there some sort of social psychological agreement on what reality is out there in the ethers in a land called Focus 27 in Monroe terms? Or is it an individual projection aspect? We've collected over 230 different reports of people and their own experiences with this thing called Hemi-Sync. So is Hemi-Sync a viable technology? Does it work? Does it change brain waves? The answer is yes. Okay. And all the literature's out there, everything to look at, but that doesn't say anything about the subjective experience that you may have. It's like saying everybody dreams, and you say, well, how come we don't all dream about the same thing? Well, we're all different people, but there's an agreement that we all have dreams. So let's turn halfway through this now away from a little understanding of what this thing called Hemi-Sync is, and move over to, well, how did Hemi-Sync get mixed up with remote viewing anyway? How did that happen, and what is that all about? Well, in a past life experience, I found myself training some people to be psychics. It was a very interesting situation for me because a friend of mine, by the name of Rob Cowart, and I were instructors at the intelligence school out in Fort Huachuca, Arizona. And we discovered a book by the folks at SRI, Russ and Hal, that said, you know, mind reach. It's about remote viewing. And here I was as a counterintelligence agent chasing spies around, making sure that we locked up our own documents and worried about bugging telephones and things like that. And I picked up this book and I said, oh man, nobody's doing anything about this. What in the world are we going to do about this? Well, a few months later, had the opportunity to be on a very special team of intelligence agents where we would go out and we would attack our U.S. facilities. We'd fly satellites over and bug their phones and do all sorts of things to demonstrate the security weaknesses of that particular installation. And then we go to the commander and say, here are the holes in your security. This is what you should do to fix them up. Well, at one of those very interesting briefings, during the exit briefing part of that, one of the managers slid across the table, mind reach, and says, well, Lieutenant, what are we supposed to do about this? And of course, our whole team had no clue as to what that was, but I knew what mind reach was all about. And I said, oh, well, I'm glad you asked about that, sir. This is a topic that we cannot cover in this discussion, but we'll be sure and get back to you on this. I was the only one that had any concept about what he was talking about. But I went back to my boss then, Major at Fort Meade, and said, sir, there's this question that's come up about this thing called remote viewing. And what are we going to do from the security standpoint to protect our organizations against this obvious threat? And he said, well, Lieutenant, what are you going to do about that? And I'm like, oh, man, it's tough being a lieutenant, you know. You're supposed to have all these answers. Well, the short story is that my little kernel in all of this government stuff of remote viewing, my little tiny piece of the pie is that I suggested to my boss, you know, sir, we probably ought to train some people just like us with already have security clearances, because we're going to be looking at classified installations and we shouldn't call 1-800-PSYCHIC and ask them what they get out of this. We probably should train. And so he says, well, Lieutenant, how are we going to do that? And I'm like, oh man, he believed me. Now what am I going to do? You know? Well, I had to get busy. I had to find out who these guys were, Russ and Hal out at SRI. So I went out to see them, tried to figure out how we were going to train people to do this. At the same time that I was visiting with Russ and Hal, I was looking around at many of these other technologies that Jeffrey Mishlove had put up on his slide about all these different traditions and all these different schools of thought that might make people psychic, and I was looking into them. But there was a special case in terms of Bob Monroe, sort of an interesting set of directions, an easy path to follow. I mean, he was just down the road from Washington, and there he was. And before I had moved to the East Coast, my mother had given me a book called Journeys Out of the Body and said, oh, you're moving to the East Coast. You probably ought to look for this guy. He lives on the East Coast. And, you know, I thought, my mother is really screwy, you know. It's like, hey, I'm going to Europe this summer. Oh, I know somebody in Europe. Say hi, you know. That's the kind of the way I felt about it at the time. But then I began to get involved in this other thing, and this book sort of surfaced again, and I was like, I wonder what this is all about anyway. So I took a journey on down to what was then the Monroe Institute of Applied Sciences, and I couldn't tell Mr. Monroe, listen, I've been tasked with training some government psychics. This was supposed to be some sort of secret program at the time. But I did go down and said, well, I'm a military officer, and I've read your book, and it seems very interesting. As a matter of fact, it reminds me of some things in childhood that happened to me. His house at that time was a place called Whistlefield Farm, which is about 10 miles from the Institute now, and I was escorted into a little patio here, and at the time I actually sat in that funny-looking chair, and he sat over here on the couch on the divan here. He was a very interesting kind of a guy, come from the 50s radio era. I was a high executive vice president in the heyday of radio. But when I met him, he was just a homebody guy. His coffee stains on his shirt and cigarette ashes falling down on him and everything. And I'm like, am I supposed to be impressed with this, you know? And, well, he wasn't caring too much about impressing anybody so much, you know. He wondered who this strange young officer was that had come to talk to him. And we were invited to go outside and chat about what went on. And I was knowing I couldn't tell him a big secret about why I was there, that I was wondering whether or not his training might involve, that's supposed to be blank, by the way, was supposed to involve some sort of maybe relaxation that would help with these people. Couldn't say all that to him, just had to tell him about things that happened to me in my childhood and that I grew up in a metaphysical family and so forth and so on. And he prodded me to tell him some stories, and I did. And then at one point in the conversation, I'm like, I have to turn this some way. I have to figure out how to make him start talking about Hemi-Sync in some way. And there was sort of this uncomfortable silence as we were sitting there waiting for, well, who's going to say something next? And he says, well, maybe you'd like to see my laboratory, and I'll show you about this technology I have called Hemi-Sync. And oh, this sounds exciting. I go do that. And he said, you know, people are able to talk about the kinds of experiences you had in childhood right while they're happening when they're listening to this Hemi-Sync. And I thought, that is really weird. And how can you do that, Mr. Monroe? And he said, well, we'll just have to show you, kid. And so I thought, oh, good. That's why he hasn't invited me into the laboratory, because there's been some, you know, wonderful experiment going on. And now I'm going to be invited in to see and observe this experiment where somebody is flying around out of their body having some big adventure. And we'll get to see this happen. Well, as we walked into the building and were introduced to the receptionist there, Mr. Monroe had some other ideas in mind. And we walked down a hallway past a room with a lot of flashing lights and tape recorders and things into another room. And he said, oh, go lie down in that bed over there and put those earphones on. And I'm like, oh, man. You know, I'm this military officer, and I'm not supposed to do weird things, you know. I'm supposed to be really, if they find out about this in my background investigation, there might be trouble, you know. So it was a strange bed, because instead of sticking out into the middle of the room like our beds in our bedroom, it was built back into the wall, recessed into the wall in some way, and there was very little furniture, no windows. And I said, what is it you want me to do? Well, lay down there and put those headphones on. Well, what are you going to do? I'll just play some music to relax. It'll be fine, so just lay down there. And I did, and just as soon as I put the headphones on and sort of laid down wondering what was going to happen, the door was closed and the lights were out. And, and I'm like, okay. Well, he did play some music. There was sort of this new agey kind of thing, and I'm like, well, okay. Turned out to be by a composer by the name of Tomita, who became very famous for his synthetic Baroque-style music. It was okay, and then the music went away, and there was the sounds of crashing waves of surf, and I thought, oh, this is cool. I was raised in Southern California. This is nice. I can get into surf. It sounds cool. And as the waves would crash in and roll out, I would get more and more relaxed, more and more sort of pretending that I could see the surf coming in. And then Bob Monroe's voice came on, and here is the sound of surf, the natural power of sound, a symbol here at the Monroe Institute. Ah, good. Here's the commercial announcement. I got that down, okay? But these sort of pretending I could see sort of visualizations continued, and as the waves would wash back out, there was a remaining little hissing or popping sound, and I began to say, oh, that must be the bubbles in the sand and the foam when the wave washes out, and hissing, and then another wave, and then this little hissing sound. And pretty soon there was one last wave that sort of washed out into the ocean in my mind, and I could still hear this popping sound, and then I heard this droning wah, 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 going on, and I thought, uh-oh, I've unplugged the earphones somehow, and there's something wrong here with this. and I couldn't figure out where this sound was coming from. Was there something wrong with the earphones here? This sound seemed to be sometimes in my head, sometimes in the earphones. I didn't know where it was coming from. Then this very unusual thing happened, and I knew why this room was strange. Because the bed began to rise up to the ceiling. I thought, this is like in the gas station when you get your oil changed. And he's got this piston under the bed that pushes the bed up, And so I'm listening very carefully. Can I hear the air compressor running in the background like you do at the gas station, And I couldn't hear that. And I wondered how strong it was, I wasn't quite this size then, but I wondered how strong it was, Maybe I could get one at my house and change my own oil or something like that, Then I began to think maybe it wasn't a piston in the floor. Maybe there were pulleys in the wall, and it was just a straight electrical motor that raised this bed up. And I began to listen for mechanical sounds. Maybe the bed would, rock against the wall or something like that. So I'm all bollocksed up in this intellectual thinking about how did he make this happen. One of those knobs in the room that we passed by must be to raise the bed up knob, along with these surf sounds he'd been playing. Well, then I began to feel something else, and I say feel like it was some sort of visceral thing, like when you're in a jet airplane and you're moving. You have a sense of motion. All the people around you and your seats and everything are there with you, but there's this awareness. I'm told that it's because of your middle ear and it's supposed to detect those things, but there's this awareness that you are moving. And that's what I was feeling laying there in the bed. And Mr. Monroe's voice came over, "Well, what's happening, kid?" And I'm like, "Well, I seem to be going someplace." "Well, where are you going, kid?" And it's like, "I don't know, this is your adventure ride. I don't know where I'm going here." It was sort of embarrassing when he would come through the earphones because I would forget about him between the times when he would talk to me. I was like, "Oh yeah, I remember I'm at the Institute. I'm laying in this bed, and there's Mr. Monroe again." Well, remember how I pretended to see the waves crashing in? There was sort of that pretending visualization again as I had this kinesthetic, this visceral sense of movement here, as though I was, this is really stupid, as though I was going down the middle of a flavor straw. Okay, remember flavor straw when you were a kid, that you'd drink sugar through it? And all thing I could think about is I would see, these gnarly crystal things going by me. This is a flavor straw, It's really strange, I know it sounds so stupid, but that's what my thinking was at the time. And I was going, maybe warp 7 or something down this flavor straw. Pretty soon I came to the end and the straw curved up. I assumed, because it was like I was arching my back and it seemed to come up. And just as I peeked out of the end of this flavor straw, suddenly my whole vision, my whole perception changed. And I was in a boundless, vast, open, no walls, totally white environment, watching myself come out of the end of the flavor straw. And my head thinking must have been, gee, I came all this way to find out I was already here, Wherever you go, there you are, kind of thing. I must have gone, oh, or ah, or made a voice sound of some kind, because immediately Mr. Monroe's voice was in my ears. Well, what just happened? And there I am, embarrassed again. I'd forgotten all about him. I sort of wondered if he was out there in that white space someplace. I was like, oh, nothing. It's okay. I'll just have to tell you later. It's okay. I don't remember how long I was out there in this white emptiness, but after time, whatever that is, after time, Mr. Monroe said, "Well, kid, it's about time for lunch." And that sounded really strange. What's lunch? This voice is telling me it's time for lunch. But for the life of me, I couldn't think of what lunch was. It was like, if this voice said it was time for lunch, it probably was, but I don't know what that is, but I guess it's okay. Well, I didn't comment back because I was too busy trying to figure out what in the world he was talking about anyways. But he changed the sound patterns, and he lowered the bed back down to the ground, okay? And before I knew it, he was opening the door, turning on the light. Well, kid, where do you want to go for lunch? Go on down the county seat down there, get a salad. Maybe want to go get a greasy hamburger. Go up on the hilltop here. You want to go up there? What do you want to do for lunch? And I'm like still in the ozone, you know. And I uncover take the covers off, and I turn around in the bed, and I'm looking under the bed, you know, like this, you know, trying to find that piston. Hey, did you drop your watch under there? What's the matter? Did you lose your wallet? And I'm like, you know, I'm like still in the ozone here. I don't know what's going on. So we're walking down the hallway on the way out, and he's behind me, you know. Hey, how's you want to go to lunch? We're going to do lunch. And I'm like, oh, man. Well, I realize now, you know, years later, this all happened in 1977. Years later, he's trying to get me outside in the sunshine, get me grounded, get me back connected, and so forth. But at the time, I didn't answer him when he said, what do you want for lunch? You know, in the time, I was thinking, man, if I get a six-pack of this stuff, this would be all right, you know. That's how you go, this for lunch, you know. But I wasn't too sure exactly what had happened and what had been going on. So at lunch, we're chatting about this Hemi-Sync stuff. He'd invented and what it was and so forth and so on. I said, well, Mr. Monroe, when you raised the bed up to the ceiling, what did you do to do that? And he kind of laughed and he said, well, you know, the bed really didn't go up. And I have this big question mark over my head, you know, and I'm like, oh. So it wasn't until sometime later at lunch where I had any, you know, resolution of my cognitive dissonance to understand what had actually happened. And then I got curious. So, Mr. Monroe, what is it about these tapes anyway? How did this tape make this happen to me? He said, oh, no, it didn't make it happen. After talking to you about your childhood and the experiences you had, I thought it'd be really easy for you if we just put you in the right environment, that these things would be very natural for you. And I'm like, well, that sounds like a cop-out. Can I ask that question a different way? Mr. Monroe, how did you discover tapes that are this powerful that would do this for people? And he said, no, you don't understand. The tape didn't do it to you. This is your own experience. This happened. And I'm like, oh, he skipped out on the question again, you know. How are we going to deal with this? Well, as it turns out, he never really answered that question directly, but after I retired from the military, he wanted somebody like me who said, what is it about this that works anyway? He called this thing that happened to me mind awake, body asleep. Obviously, I went back and recommended to my boss. I didn't tell him a little adventure I'd had, but I recommended to my boss that I think this technology might help our people open up to perceive things outside the physical domain. Well, that was 77. In 1983, we had a contract with Mr. Monroe to train Joe McMoneagle for 10 weeks. 10 weeks of training personally with Mr. Monroe on a private contract. And this 10 weeks were non-consecutive weeks and stretched out over a period of 1 year. So he would go down and go through some training and then come back. Now, this is when I had to decide, how are we going to measure, notice the symbology there, measure. How are we going to measure whether or not Joe is actually doing better at remote viewing? Is this really helping Joe in getting in touch with some things? And that's when the famous remote viewing of Mars situation happened, is during this training cycle. Now, there have been several others that you may have heard about. Devil's Tower, Wyoming was a very interesting target that Joe, you know, one of those name the target kinds of things. And the St. Louis Arch is another one we did. It was a name the target kind of a situation. You know, Joe's saying, this is a shiny thing and people ride in it. Well, back up, Joe. Well, it says, well, back up, Joe. Well, back up, Joe. Oh, it's that St. Louis Arch thing, you know. So, matter of being able to recognize, to put together those elements, to assemble the bits of data to where it becomes a recognizable form. But in challenging Joe, Hal Puthoff had given me a set of coordinates on the planet Mars of unusual structures. And so I thought maybe this would be a good time to find out about training Joe in this. And the methodology we used was just to write on a 3x5 card this information, the planet Mars, 1 million years BC. Put that 3x5 card, I was the only one that knew this was written on it, put that 3x5 card in the breast pocket of Mr. Monroe's jacket. He didn't know what that was. And then I had a separate piece of paper with a set of coordinates on it that I was going to read to Joe. So as the session started, at this time Joe's a real good remote viewer, so we just say, describe the target in the envelope. And that's all we had to tell him. Now, this is an area of that kind of double-blind world. Was this a pure double-blind situation? No. I sort of knew that he was supposed to be on Mars, although I didn't know what he was going to find there. So there might be some sort of leakage telepathically or in the intonation of my voice. We were in remote rooms operating off microphones and earphones, so my gesturing wouldn't have polluted the thing. But let's keep that in mind. This isn't a perfect double-blind, although I'll tell you later there are 3 indicators that are real interesting here. This was all done back in the early 80s. I was able to find some imagery to match the coordinates that he looked at, so I have some USGS imagery here.
Using the information in the envelope, focus on 40.89 degrees north, 9.55 degrees west.
Let's see what it looks like. It's what it looks. I've got an oblique view of a pyramid, a pyramidal form. It's very high. It's kind of sitting in a large depressed area.
All right.
It's yellowish, ochre colored.
All right. Move in time to the time indicated in the envelope I provided you and describe what's happening.
Impression of severe clouds, more like dust storm, geologic problem. Seems to be like I gotta iron this out, it's a little weird.
Just report your raw perceptions at this time. You're still early in the session.
I'm looking at an after effect from a major geologic problem.
Okay, go back to the time before the geologic problem.
Total difference. It's before there's no hill. It's like mounds of dirt appear, and they disappear when you go before. You see large flat surfaces, very smooth angles, walls. They're really large, though. I mean, they're megalithic.
At this period in time now, before the geologic activity, look around, in and around this area, see if you can find any activity.
You're saying it's like a perception of a shadow of people. Very tall, and it's only a shadow. It's as if they were there and they're not there anymore.
Go back to a period of time where they are there.
It's like I get a lot of static on the line and everything. It's breaking up all the time. Very fragmentary pieces.
Just report the raw data. Don't try to put things together. Just report the raw data.
I'm seeing very large people. They appear thin and tall, but they're very large, wearing some kind of strange clothes.
Okay, now remember that Joe had no idea what he was supposed to be looking at. It could have been a submarine or an airplane or a Soviet spy or whatever good old Skip had brought down from Fort Meade that day for him to work on. But when he started describing this arid climate in a distant place, I thought, oh, maybe this is going to be a good session after all. He went on to describe 8 different locations on Mars, and moving back in time, perhaps many hundreds of thousands of years, he found a race of beings that were wiped out by some cataclysmic event, perhaps like a comet striking the planet and ripping the atmosphere away from the planet. It's going to be a very interesting event in the 21st century as we move to Mars and explore these structures which are suspect for being artificial structures, and a whole new area for archaeology. I mean, here on Earth, we look back 1,000 years, 10,000 years, maybe 100,000 years. But here we might be looking at archaeological situations that are many hundreds of thousands of years ago. This being a whole new science. Now, what about this thing, Hemi-Sync and remote viewing? Did the Hemi-Sync enhance or make Joe's remote viewing better? I think the answer to that is no. Joe was a really good remote viewer. If you ask Joe what his personal opinion is, which is not really a good thing to do with remote viewers, they don't have a clue as to whether a target's right or wrong. But he says it helps him to calm down. It helps him to get into a state. And he was able eventually to set aside the tapes and not listen to the tapes anymore and just kind of capture for himself that relaxed, introspective sort of mental state. Now, the reason that I was attracted to going down to Monroe was that I had established, after studying the world of remote viewing and trying to answer my boss's question, how are you going to train these people, Lieutenant? My own sort of concepts of thought of, it seemed to me that relaxation, connecting, listening, becoming aware, and reporting and objectifying. I was a trained psychologist as a behaviorist, so I tend to reduce my view of the world into identifiable behaviors, and those things seem to be appropriate. And the Monroe sort of concept was similar, although they had a 3-concept situation instead of a 5-concept situation. So I was attracted to move in that direction. But I wouldn't say that Hemi-Sync is the all-be-it-all answer. There are probably many disciplines that can teach this relaxation state, getting into this particular, we call them focus levels, getting into this particular focus that's going to be beneficial for that first relaxation part, that first meditation part. Also, exploring these dynamics seems to have a spiritual awakening for many. And as we saw from Dean Radin's data, people that are meditators and are spiritually oriented are statistically in the high scores. Now, we can't say that causes it to happen, but we can look at that and say, well, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? I want to leave you with another thought here other than the exploration of Mars in the 21st century. I want to leave you with 1983, Joe McMoneagle. What did this mean to him when he realized that not only did his consciousness extend beyond the bounds of his physical body and that he could report information a few decades forward or backwards, report information about Florida or about the Soviet Union equally, and then he's faced with across the solar system and a movement in time of many hundreds of thousands of years with information that looks very interesting. What does that do to him? What does it do to you? Who are we as human beings if our knowledge, our access is boundless, limitless? How do we redefine who and what we are? Russ talked about, pulling out his business card and saying, this is who I am. This is my story. F. Holmes Atwater, Director of Research, the Monroe Institute. That's my story. But what does this mean when Joe McMoneagle and others of you find that they are much, much greater than they thought they were? This is such an important aspect that I was finally convinced to write a book about it. And this whole thing of the Mars situation is such an example that it's included free with the book. I put together a CD with lots of interesting things that come with the book, and I included this Mars talk that you've just heard and all 8 sites on Mars and the full story told by Joe about this race of beings on the CD, because I want it out there. I want everybody to realize who they are. I've got the videotapes out there if you don't want to wait for the book to come out, who are you? When I put people in the booth at the Monroe Institute, we talk about the experience they're going to have and what are their goals in this particular meditation, and we talk about that and we outline that. And then after they're through with their adventure, I say, you know, what you've done here is just sort of a microcosm of your whole life. There's no reason why your experience, your spiritual interconnectedness that you've just had here in this experience can't extend into all of your life. You don't have to lay down and put the headphones on to be who you are. So, as a young lieutenant, my coming up with these 5 steps for remote viewing, in closing, I'd like to bring you to that point now in all of your life. And what is that? Relax. Everything's okay. Just relax. Listen. Listen. Become aware. Realize what you're listening to. Okay? Connecting with that and realizing it. Okay? And then objectify. Be every day in every way who you really are. I'm supposed to now go to questions, but I've given you all the answers.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention. I bought all 4 of your videos. They're incredible. I love them. And I recommend them to everybody, particularly like in the metaphysical groups that I'm in. And I think what happened on Mars and beneath the planet is spectacular, that it's going to be a life-changing event for everybody. Specifically at the end, Joe talks about, communicates with one of these beings, and they talk about finding another planet, somewhere to go to continue their civilization. Is there any, what do you believe about, or knowledge that maybe they came to Earth, given the similarity with the monuments on Mars and the monuments on Earth and the other structures?
Well, I think that's a neat mythology. You know, I think a lot of people in the next 20 years will write a lot of books about that, a lot of stories and lots of TV and radio interviews. I'm clueless, but it really makes a very neat story. Is it possible that the origin of our species was an escape from Mars millions and millions of years ago?
Makes great Hollywood movies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Skip, what if you're deaf?
What?
What?
What if you're deaf?
How does Hemi-Sync work? Or does it?
Works very well.
If you're deaf?
Yes.
If you can't hear it?
No, I understand. She's coming up with a question that's always asked. If you have reduced hearing in one ear, then you can still use the stereo effect. An interesting thing about binaural beats is the brain picks it up, even if one channel is 20 decibels below the other channel. Okay? If you are totally deaf, you just mix it together in mono, so you get the pulsing in mono. I mean, for thousands of years, people have been beating drums and chanting against walls and dancing. Sure, it would work in mono if you hooked it together in mono. The way to find out is there's a little $9.95 tape called The Way of Hemi-Sync. You know, you get on the website, listen to that, and if you hear the wah, 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 it's working. If you don't, return the $9.95, you know.
Okay. We have a question over here.
Is there a difference between doing meditation and reaching alpha state and listening to Hemi-Sync and reaching alpha state in your brain?
Well, the alpha state is defined by TM, or Transcendental Meditators, is an interesting concept, because remember we showed here where the alpha was usually in the back of the head, and that's called resting state alpha. In TM, Transcendental Meditation, that alpha moves forward across the frontals here. So it's an entirely different kind of alpha state. The alpha state that people experience on what we call Focus 12 is very similar to TM alpha state.